Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third ePortfolio workshop. Today, we're going to be focusing on design and content. My name is Lindsay. I'm the academic advisor for Knights of Distinction.
Hi, I'm Kara. I am the graduate assistant and ePortfolio specialist.
So as we're going through the presentation here, you'll notice that we've got PDFs of what we'll be talking about in the second half of the presentation available in the web course for you guys, so you can download the PDFs and print them out or fill in the worksheets as we go along here. Let's go ahead and get started.
So the first thing that we want to talk about is obviously the home page of your ePortfolio. This is the first thing that your audience is going to see. So it's really important to know who your audience is when you're creating the home page of your ePortfolio, because you want to consider what kind of a first impression you want to make on your audience. So some things to think about are the color scheme and the image and graphics that you include. Someone who is looking at being an elementary school teacher can do different things than someone who's looking at being an engineer, just because there's different things that your audience is going to expect of you and that they would find acceptable aesthetically with your ePortfolio. Things to also think about are content and navigation. So some people include different kinds of content on their homepage. The example that we've provided here is Rachel Helm's ePortfolio, and I chose this example because I think that Rachel does a good job of providing enough information that if you didn't go anywhere else on her ePortfolio, you still get a good sense of who she is. The portfolio is very clean and simple. It has a brief description of who she is and what her career goals are, but also provides access if you want to know more about her, and also provides a link to her resume if you want to view that information. So if I was at a future employer and I saw nothing else but the homepage of Rachel's ePortfolio, I'm still getting a good sense of who she is, and I'm getting the information that I need from her.
Later on in the presentation, we're going to actually walk you through different iterations of Kara's ePortfolio as she's developed it for graduate school, and now that she's getting ready to move past grad school and graduate and enter her professional career, she's adapted it for that audience. As we go through the presentation here, you'll see some different techniques that students have used on their home pages. One thing to keep in mind with that is to remember that your home page should indicate an action that you want your audience to take. So for example, if you've got a link to your resume or CV right on your home page, that's the first thing they're seeing, then that's indicating that you're wanting them to look at that first. So with that in mind, if you opt to include a 2 to 3 sentence short description or bio of yourself, welcoming your audience maybe, then you should indicate where you want them to go from there. So do you want them to look at your areas of focus? Are you giving them just a brief description of what they can find in your ePortfolio? And again, there's no really right or wrong for this. You should just think about what you want your audience to do with the information on your homepage. Another thing to keep in mind, so is color scheme. Sometimes students struggle with the aesthetic component of this. So there are a couple of ways you can work with that. If you're not as good with choosing a color scheme, or you're unsure of what colors might work well together, you can always use an online color palette generator. ColorMind is a good one that's free. You can sign up, and it will give you a palette that you can work with for your ePortfolio.
And later on in the presentation, we'll also talk about a couple of resources for if you need like some stock images for the background of your ePortfolio, or for if you need icons or just things that images that you don't have for yourself. We'll talk about some resources for that as well. So one more thing to consider too with your homepage is the navigation. So with Rachel's ePortfolio, she has her navigation right across the top of her homepage in the header. On my ePortfolio, you'll see that I have that as well. Some people like to have it along the side, or they have it in kind of a pop-out menu where you can click on it and then the navigation becomes available. So same as with content and images and graphics, there's not really like a right or wrong answer with how you do your navigation, but it is important to make sure that your navigation is easily accessible, that your audience can find it very quickly, and that they can as Lindsay said, it indicates an action to them. So make sure that your navigation shows all of the material that you have available on your ePortfolio and kind of tells your audience where to go.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the About Me page. We've got a couple of different options on here for you. So your About Me page should give your audience an idea of who you are and what your career goals are. So you'll remember in the last workshop in session 2, we went over the leadership reflection where we had talked through different techniques that the student used for identifying their career goals. And one of the things that a lot of students said in the feedback when we were critiquing that was that the student waited until the very end to identify what her career goals were, which is fine for that reflection. And that was something that was ultimately fixed by the time she got to the final version of the ePortfolio. But you should keep that in mind. So your About Me page, ideally you should indicate your major and what your career goals are within the first 3 to 4 sentences of your opening paragraph so that your audience is quickly able to identify that. And they can either skim through the rest of it or perhaps they want to read it carefully, depending on what information they're trying to find. So the sooner and more clearly articulated that you have that information, the more useful it will be for your audience.
Yeah, so the examples that we provided for you are focused on 2 different things. Javon's example, his About Me is kind of more focused on an audience who is an employer. So he's talking about the field that he wants to go into, which is public relations, and looking at managing crises specifically in the media field. And so his description for his About Me is relatively short, as you can see, and it talks about the things that he's interested in. It names the specific area within his career field that he's interested in pursuing and kind of what his plans are and how to pursue that. And it's very career focused, very focused on getting a job. And then Sarah's ePortfolio, her audience is more about graduate school. She was an English major, and so she's looking at pursuing higher education. And so her About Me is a little bit longer. You only see a short piece of it here, but if you click on the picture, it'll take you to her ePortfolio, and you can see that her About Me is longer than Javon's, which works for her fields because she is working in the humanities, specifically in English, and so she can talk about some of the research that she's already done and then the areas of research that she's still interested in pursuing in that field. So those are things to consider when you do your About Me, as well as who your audience is and what you want to communicate to them, but also how you want to do that. Some fields, it's okay to have a longer About Me, but some fields you might want to be more concise and to the point.
You might find it useful to look through some of the sample ePortfolios in the Knights of Distinction web course located in the capstone module under resources. We've got a lot of samples from different majors. So you can see a lot of different students using different techniques for their About Me pages. So just keep that in mind as you're creating your About Me page. And also with the About Me pages, so one way you can think about doing this is if you are going to use this in the future to apply to graduate schools, or maybe you're going to include this as a link on a resume for when you're entering the job market, you can come back to this and you can use parts of this to develop your, say, personal statement for graduate school or your cover letter in the future. You would always want to tailor your personal statement and your cover letter for jobs to the graduate program or the company or organization that you're applying to. So you wouldn't want to straight copy and paste what you create for this, into a personal statement for graduate school. You want to do your due diligence, do your research, and make sure that you're adapting appropriately. But you can certainly adapt from this. It gives you a head start. It gives you a chance to get some feedback on your personal statement if you're thinking about using it for that. So this can be kind of a more general approach to a personal statement or a cover letter for a job.
So for CVs and resumes, the first thing to keep in mind is choosing whether or not you're going to include just a CV, just a resume, or maybe one of each on your ePortfolio. And that will depend on who your audience is and who and what career field you're going into. For myself, you'll see on my ePortfolio when we take a look at that I have both a resume and a CV. And that's because when I'm pursuing jobs at high schools, teaching at a high school, all they're really going to need from me is a resume. But I might also be pursuing jobs in academia where I'm looking at teaching at colleges or pursuing research in my field. And so that's where people would want to see a CV that has my publications and my teaching experience and my presentations and conferences that I've attended. So your CV is kind of more of a collective place where all of your accomplishments and things that you've done are listed, and it's usually a longer document, and then your resume is kind of that short and sweet, more tailored to whatever it is that you're applying for. So those are just things to keep in mind. And then as far as how you display your CV and resume, there's a couple of different choices. In the example here, you can see that Stefan included a chunk of his resume on his ePortfolio. He included some of his most relevant experiences as well as descriptions of what those experiences were and what he got from them. And for engineering, that really worked for Stefan because it's really important for him to show the hard skills that he has in the different computer engineering projects that he's worked on throughout his time at UCF. So even if you choose to include the entirety of your resume as a page in your ePortfolio, I would also suggest including a download button like Stefan has on his ePortfolio, because if someone wants to, if an employer or someone that's interested wants to print your resume, you don't want them to have to print your entire website page. It's easier if you have it included as a download button so they can just download a copy of it and print it. So something else to consider is that you'll want to include your CV or resume as a PDF instead of a Word doc. One, because you don't want people to be able to edit your materials. And two, because a PDF looks more professional because it's a finished document. Also, you'll want to make sure that you don't have any personal information like your address or phone number. If you want to include your phone number, that's a choice that you can make, but just be aware that this is going to be on the internet so people can access that information. So on my resume, I just have my email, and then resumes that I print out and bring to employers personally, I'll have my phone number and address, but for things that are going on the internet, I just include my email, and then people can contact me if they want more information.
I think having the PDF, like Kara said, it's safer in a lot of ways, but it will also retain the structure and the formatting. So you'll notice on a lot of the student ePortfolios, a lot of students will choose to either have their CV or their resume actually formatted onto the page in the ePortfolio. And then as Kara pointed out, they have a download resume or download CV button at the top. So this gives you some content for that page as opposed to perhaps just having like a CV page and then just having like one document on that. I would suggest if you choose to do it that way, that's fine, but have some other artifact on that page so that it's not just one thing. If you do choose to format it with content on your resume page like Stefan did, that's fine, but I would definitely recommend choosing one or the other to display there. Okay, so for example, if you're going to display your resume on the actual resume page, that's fine. Don't try to include your resume and your CV on the actual page. It gets too difficult for your audience to parse through. Like Kara said before, choose one or the other to display on the page, and then you can include download buttons for both if you choose to do so. So you can, at the top of the page, you can have download CV, download resume, and then maybe you only choose to display your resume on the page. So just it helps your audience navigate the portfolio and avoid any confusion.
So your areas of focus can be the most difficult part of building your ePortfolio because it's hard to sort through all of your artifacts and your reflections and kind of narrow down and figure out what are the 3 ways to label these skills that I want to highlight for my audience. So something that you might want to look at is the patterns that are evident throughout the artifacts that you have that you want to display, and the patterns of the skills that are showing up throughout your experiences and your reflections that you're writing for each milestone. And just think about what it is that your audience wants to see from you. So what hard or soft skills does your audience need to see, and how can you sort your artifacts and your reflections into those categories? And your areas of focus don't have to look the same on the page on your ePortfolio. The example that that's at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide, you can see that these are two very different pages, but they have a very similar scheme. So they still look like they belong in the same website, but they still look different, and it gives the eye something to look at with each page.
Yeah, I think with your areas of focus, we talked a little bit in session 2 about how to start to outline what your areas of focus should be. So as you're doing your reflections, and by this point, you should have 3 or 4 reflections written for your milestones. So read back through those and start to, write down like overlaps in skills that you're articulating, note skills that you're continuously adapting to different situations or developing in different contexts. And, so for example, if you find yourself like using a lot of intercommunication or communication skills, maybe communication should be one area of focus. Even if you change the title of that, like you don't like saying communication, it just gives you an idea of what it should be. And that can help you sort through what parts of the reflections you're going to adapt later on when you get to the point of adding content to those pages. And one thing we did want to mention also is I think it's useful to think about the structure of your areas of focus pages. So do you have them set up under maybe a heading that's areas of focus, and then you have 3 subpages, one for each area? Do you have them as individual pages set up? It's one of those things, again, that we've talked about a few times, like there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's what you prefer, what you think your audience would be the most useful for your audience. But it is something, the structure of it is something to start thinking about how you want to display that for your audience.
So the last thing is kind of the aesthetic quality of where you're going to put your content in your ePortfolio. So thinking about not only how are you going to organize your artifacts and reflections into your different areas of focus, but how you're going to display that content on your site. And you want to think about a few things here. You want to think about the aesthetic quality, so just making sure that it looks organized and that it looks professional, and like you've put some effort and thought into where things are on your ePortfolio. And the example that we chose here kind of shows you how this student put an image, wrapped the text around the image, which can be a really nice thing so that your image isn't like taking up a bunch of additional space. It's kind of part of the text, and it makes your audience look at it because they're reading anyway. And then the student also included a caption for the image, which is really helpful. One, just so that people know what's going on in the image, and 2, for accessibility purposes. If you have captions, then text readers can pick up on that if someone's looking at your website that needs that kind of function. So there's another thing to consider would be accessibility. So thinking about fonts, the fonts you're choosing, making sure they're easily readable, that they're large enough for your audience, thinking about color schemes and using colors that are going to contrast well and make things readable. And just thinking about your audience's preference as well. Some audiences are going to want to see more personality and see more personal objects, and are going to want to see a lot of customization on these websites or on your ePortfolio, whereas other audiences are just kind of looking more at what is the content rather than how you're placing the content. But just making sure that you're speaking to whatever your career field is and whoever is going to be looking at your ePortfolio.
So we have a couple of resources. So we mentioned earlier in the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about images and artifacts. So if you find yourself in a spot where you might have a few images or pictures of yourself engaging in different experiences, but you don't have a ton that maybe reflect your areas of focus or the experiences that you're talking about in your ePortfolio. There are a couple of ways to deal with that. So you'll notice here we've got unsplash.com as well as Creative Commons. These are both platforms where you can go, websites where you can go and download copyright-free images.
Yeah, so Unsplash has, as Lindsay said, they have copyright-free images, and they're really, really beautiful images, and you can search the website with your own search terms and kind of find images that work for you. So when we look at my ePortfolio, my background image is an image from Unsplash, and it's just kind of a basic general image of hands and books and a very like writerly looking thing. And that's just something that I searched for in the on Unsplash's website. I think I just typed like writing and that came up. So just being able to find images that relate to you, but that also kind of look a little bit more personal than just a general like random stock photo that you find on the internet. And these add just a really professional look to your ePortfolio as well. And we've had some people express concern about will these images look less personal because they're not your images and they're not images of you? And that's something to consider as well is if you have a ton of these, if you only use stock images, or if you don't use them well, then it can leave your ePortfolio looking a little less personal and less like you. But depending on how you use the images, if you use them carefully and you kind of mix them in with images that are your own, then that it still gives off that personal effect. And you'll see that when we look at my ePortfolio.
Yeah, and I think we both recommend avoid using stock images where it's showing other people's faces that are not you, unless you can explain that. It's going to, it might be perceived as a drawback for your audience. They're going to be like, who is that? So like Kara said, there are a lot of great images, both in Creative Commons and Unsplash, where you can, it'll help you balance, I guess, the more personal photos that you do have with some of the more engaging ones that don't have, I guess, like headshots of other people.
Well, and think about what you're searching for when you're looking for these images. We had a student that is an accountant, and he wanted an image for his work experience page, but he didn't have a picture of him like being an accountant. But he wanted an image there, and when we started to look for pictures on Unsplash, the first thing that I typed was like accountant or calculator, because that's what I think of when I think accountant. And he expressed that he didn't want to do just like an image of hands typing on a calculator because that seems really impersonal and really kind of cliche for his field. So we ended up going with an image of like two men in business wear kind of shaking hands to show more of a collaborative and personal feel rather than just one person alone at a calculator. So be thinking about what kinds of images you're choosing, even if you are using the stock photos, and what kind of vibe that you want your ePortfolio to give off.
All right, so we're going to take a minute here and go through Kara's ePortfolio. So as we mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation, Kara's ePortfolio has gone through a couple of different iterations, and it's something that it's still in progress. So it's something she's still working on actively as she's getting ready to graduate.
So this is the home page for my ePortfolio, and as you can see, I chose a similar approach to the student example for the home page that we showed in the PowerPoint. It's very clean and simple. I don't have a description of myself, but I do have 3 roles underneath my name, and those correlate with my areas of focus. So I have writer, teacher, and learner, and then my areas of focus are writing, teaching, and learning. And you'll also see what Lindsay referenced about me having a different approach to including my resume and CV, is that instead of having a separate page for my resume and CV, I'd have them just included as download buttons on the home page here. And I did that because I wanted anybody that looked at my ePortfolio to have easy access to information that they would need. So if they never left, or if they never went anywhere beyond my homepage, they still could find all of my credentials and experiences, even if they didn't read through my areas of focus. So the next thing that I have is my About Me page, and included here is an elevator speech video that I was able to make with the Knights of Distinction program. So even if you don't have a studio and someone to professionally film it, like I was lucky enough to have, you can still do something like this on your own. And it's something that's nice to include. If you don't want to include that, that's also fine. Some people put a headshot here or just something to kind of make this personal. And then just a short description of kind of what my credentials are, where I got my degrees and what they're in, but also my goal of teaching English language arts and kind of why I want to do that and why I pursued a master's degree in order to take that path. So I also have my contact page, my contact information there, just to kind of streamline everything and include it in one page.
Yeah. So something different about Kara's ePortfolio too is that rather than having her areas of focus, like defining them as saying, having containing the words, I guess, areas of focus with subpages, she took the approach of just having them displayed in the main navigation. So again, like we talked about earlier, that's just a different way you can choose to display your content.
So my first area of focus is writing, and here I wanted to talk about the writing that I've done while I'm in grad school, but also the things that I bring to a classroom, to a high school classroom, as someone who has a master's degree in creative writing. So here I talked about the people that I've gotten to work with in workshop, but also the things that I've learned about how to be a person that's involved in the writing community. And the different things that I've experienced in the writing community, like conferences and readings and networking and those sorts of things. So I've included pictures of myself at different readings that I've conducted. There's also an audio clip of a reading that I did last year, and then there are also links to my published works at the bottom of the page. And you'll also see that I have a link to my undergraduate works. I had, when I initially did my ePortfolio, when I first made it almost 2 years ago now, it was more focused on just kind of collecting my graduate school experiences, but it also just had a lot of my things from undergrad because I didn't have a lot of stuff from grad school yet because I was just starting out. So we'll actually include here, you can see an old version of my ePortfolio and my site history. You can see that I divided my writing up by genre and then included a lot of my undergraduate experiences, and they were kind of front and center. This was my only content. But now that I have more experience in grad school and I have more things to display, then I kept my undergraduate works because I still wanted people to be able to see them if they wanted access to them, but they're kind of secondary and off on their own page. And the main stuff is everything that I've done in grad school.
I think this is a good example too of, by using these platforms, Wix, Adobe Spark, you own the portfolio, you have agency with it, so you can update it, you can adapt it, use it for whatever purposes you want to use it for after you graduate from UCF.
And your ePortfolio is always going to change depending on who your audience is. So you should be continuously adding stuff to it as you have new experiences, just like I'll continue to update this page as I get more publications. But also my audience used to be more of a grad school audience and kind of showing schools what I had done already. Whereas now my audience is employers, and I want to show them what I did in my MFA program, but also how I'm going to apply that to my teaching career. So if you read my reflections, you will see that the talk has changed from here are all the hard skills that I'm learning to here is how I'm going to take my experiences and apply them in the classroom. And this is what makes me a really, really great high school teacher. So think about those kinds of things and know that your ePortfolio is going to go through a lot of drafts in this building process. So the next page I have is my teaching. This is my next area of focus. And I just have a teaching philosophy here, as well as a headshot from a yearbook from when I was teaching. And then I have samples of my high school materials and my college materials. Originally, my teaching area of focus was more centered around just the college teaching that I've done and was kind of speaking to a college audience. And so it had just my teaching materials for my composition course. But now that I'm looking at teaching high school English again, I also have my high school teaching materials from when I taught high school previously. And you'll also see that I have arrows at the top of the pages in the kind of secondary pages for my area of focus, because I want people to be encouraged to navigate back and forth within this area of focus. So kind of like Lindsay was saying at the beginning of the presentation about how you want your pages to suggest an action to your audience, I wanted to suggest that my audience look at my materials, but also that they continue on and look at all of the materials that I have available. And then they are also able to navigate back to my teaching philosophy.
I think it's also cool how you structured, or I guess how you placed your some of the stock images with your personal photos. So on some pages, you'll see more personal photos. On other pages, you'll see a couple of the stock images, but it's done in a way that as you're navigating it's back and forth between each page, you don't hit like 3 or 4 pages in a row with all stock images. There's a good balance of your own pictures as well as ones that you've taken from Unsplash or Creative Commons.
So my last area of focus was learning, and I called this page learning, but it's about professional development. I liked that my areas of focus, I liked keeping them as like 3 different verbs, and so I wanted to do something with professional development, but I wanted to keep in the theme of writing and teaching. And so instead of putting professionally developing, because it doesn't have the same kind of ring to it, I went with learning, and that seemed to really suit what I wanted to capture in this area of focus, which was that as a teacher and as a writer, I am constantly going to be learning still. I'm always going to be a student because it's important in both of those fields to be constantly honing my craft and learning about what's going on in that field and what's contemporary. So here I talked about different conferences I've attended and different readings and lectures I've been a part of, or that I've attended and listened to, but also I've talked about sharing my own research and giving presentations through my role here at the QEP, and also just giving presentations through my college and presenting my own writing and research as a student.
Okay, so as you guys might remember from the last session, this was originally filmed during a face-to-face workshop style presentation. So we had students in the classroom and we were doing activities with them to help them nail down their areas of focus and get some feedback on their reflections. So for this portion of the presentation, we're just going to quickly go through some of the activities that we did. So if you want to take some time and do those on your own, you can. We'll have the worksheets and all of the PDFs that we used during the workshop available when you go to watch the video, so you'll have access to everything. Okay, so the first activity we did was choosing your areas of focus exercise. So if you open up that PDF, we also have the questions displayed on the screen, but you can print out the PDF if you want to fill in the worksheet yourself. So we have a couple of questions on here to just get you thinking about how you can outline your areas of focus, depending on which reflections you chose to complete and what skills you're continuously articulating throughout those reflections.
So some of the questions that we want you to think about in choosing your areas of focus are: what skills and experiences do you plan to reflect on, and what patterns do you notice between those experiences and skills that you've developed through those experiences? So this kind of helps you to see if you aren't sure what your audience wants to see as far as what skills you need to be demonstrating for them, this kind of helps you to see what are the skills that you're developing through the experiences, and that you're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about.
For the second question here, you're going to think about your audience and what skills you want them to know about you, or what skills you want to highlight for them. Think about what artifacts you have to demonstrate those skills. So maybe what pictures you're going to include, what presentations you have, maybe from your classes if you're talking about some of your classes in these reflections. And then for the third part of this exercise, you are going to outline 3 areas of focus. So what we did for this part is we just took like a blank sheet of paper, split it into 3 columns. In each column, you should write your area of focus. So 3 columns total, 3 areas of focus. And then you can take sticky notes or maybe just write directly onto the piece of paper which artifacts you're going to use to represent each area of focus. Okay, and then for the last part of this workshop, we had students split into groups of 2, and they brought in 2 reflections for 2 more milestones. So those were of your choice. And they did the reflection feedback worksheet again to give each other some directed feedback on those reflections. So we have that available here for you. I'm also including the self-reflection worksheet since you might be doing this on your own. In that case, if you don't have someone else to kind of peer review it, I suggest doing the self-reflection exercise worksheet. You'll get similar results. This is just more directed so that you can do this on your own if you're watching this later. So if that's the case, then go ahead and open up the self-reflection exercise PDF. And again, that's available for you to print out and fill out on your own so that you can kind of revise on your own. Keep in mind, you can also submit your reflections to the web course, and Kara and I will be happy to give you some feedback there as well. And for the next session, which is the final session taking place on April 3rd, so we will post it hopefully later that week. We're going to have you guys add your home page, so have that set up, have your little either 2 to 3 sentence bio or synthesis of what your ePortfolio is, or have your CV and resume there. So have that structurally set up how you want it to look. You're also going to do your About Me page, so you'll have that page set up and go ahead and write your About Me page, put content in it. And then you'll have your resume or CV page set up as well with either that information there. If you choose to include your CV and resume just on your home page, then you don't need to worry about having a separate page for that. So it doesn't need to be in 2 places unless you want it to be. And remember that these are drafts, so it's okay if you just have the if you just create the drafts of these and get some feedback later, that's fine. If you are graduating this semester, your ePortfolio is due on April 8th, so definitely keep that in mind. I recommend submitting it the sooner the better. We can give you some feedback if you submit it before April 3rd. So keep in mind these sometimes have to go through 2 or 3 iterations, so the sooner you get that in, the sooner we can give you some feedback and you can start making those revisions if you need to. Thank you guys for viewing the presentation, and we'll see you next time.